The invasion of Iraq in March 2003 did not emerge from a vacuum. Its origins stretched back more than a decade to the Gulf War of 1990 to 1991, and the unsatisfying conclusion that left Saddam Hussein in power. That earlier conflict had achieved its immediate objective, the liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, but had created a strategic situation that successive American administrations found increasingly untenable. Understanding why the United States ultimately chose war in 2003 requires examining the accumulated frustrations, ideological currents, and transformative shock of the 11th of September 2001 that together produced one of the most consequential and controversial military interventions in American history. When Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the administration of George H.W. Bush assembled a remarkable international coalition to reverse the aggression. Operation Desert Storm demonstrated American military supremacy in devastating fashion. Iraqi forces were routed in a ground campaign lasting merely 100 hours. Yet the elder Bush chose not to march on Baghdad. The coalition mandate extended only to liberating Kuwait, and pursuing regime change risked fracturing the international consensus that had made military action possible. American commanders also feared the prospect of urban warfare in Baghdad and the quagmire of occupation that would follow. This decision left Saddam Hussein in power, humiliated but not destroyed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Shia populations in southern Iraq and Kurds in the north rose against his regime, encouraged by American rhetoric calling for Iraqis to take matters into their own hands. The United States did not intervene, as Saddam's forces brutally suppressed these uprisings. The spectacle of American inaction, as Saddam's helicopters massacred rebels, created lasting bitterness and raised questions about American credibility that would echo for years. The ceasefire agreement that ended the Gulf War imposed stringent conditions on Iraq. Under United Nations Security Council Resolution 687, Iraq was required to eliminate all weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear, as well as ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 150 kilometers. The resolution established the United Nations Special Commission, known as UNSCOM, to verify Iraqi compliance. Economic sanctions imposed after the invasion of Kuwait would remain in place until Iraq fulfilled its disarmament obligations. What followed was more than a decade of confrontation between Iraq and the international community. UNSCOM inspectors discovered extensive weapons programs that exceeded pre-war intelligence estimates. They located hundreds of tons of chemical weapons agents, uncovered a major biological weapons production facility, found equipment for uranium enrichment, and identified dozens of missiles and warheads. The inspection regime achieved significant disarmament, destroying more Iraqi weapons capability than coalition bombing had accomplished during the war itself. Yet Iraqi authorities never fully cooperated. They concealed facilities, moved equipment, destroyed evidence, and obstructed inspectors at critical junctures. The pattern was one of grudging compliance. Punctuated by crises, Iraq would resist. The United States would threaten military action, and a diplomatic resolution would be reached, only for the cycle to repeat. By 1998, the confrontation had reached a breaking point. Iraq expelled American inspectors, accusing UNSCOM of espionage allegations that later proved partially correct, as American intelligence agencies had indeed exploited the inspection regime for their own purposes. In December 1998, the United States and Britain launched Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day bombing campaign against suspected weapons sites and regime targets. UNSCOM inspectors withdrew before the strikes and never returned. The inspection regime effectively collapsed, leaving fundamental questions about Iraqi weapons programs unanswered. For the next 4 years, until new inspectors entered Iraq in late 2002, the international community possessed no reliable means of verifying what Saddam Hussein was doing. The sanctions regime and its discontents. Throughout the 1,990 seconds, economic sanctions imposed after the Gulf War inflicted tremendous hardship on the Iraqi population. Critics argued that sanctions caused malnutrition, disease, and excess mortality among civilians who bore no responsibility for their government's actions. The Oil for Food program, established in 1996, attempted to mitigate humanitarian suffering by allowing Iraq to sell oil and use the proceeds for food and medicine. But the program was plagued by delays, bureaucratic obstacles, and manipulation by both the Iraqi regime and international actors. The humanitarian costs of sanctions eroded international consensus for maintaining pressure on Iraq. France, Russia, and China grew increasingly sympathetic to Iraqi arguments that the country had sufficiently disarmed and that sanctions should be lifted. The United States and Britain countered that Iraq had not fulfilled its obligations and that lifting sanctions would allow Saddam to reconstitute his weapons programs. This divide within the Security Council would prove decisive. When the Bush administration sought international authorization for war in 2003, perhaps more significantly, American officials made clear by the late 1,990 seconds that sanctions would not be lifted as long as Saddam Hussein remained in power. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stated publicly that the United States would work to maintain sanctions regardless of Iraqi compliance with disarmament requirements. This position removed the only incentive Iraq had for cooperation and raised fundamental questions about American objectives. If regime change had become the goal rather than disarmament, then the entire framework of Security Council resolutions was being subverted. The no-fly zones established after the Gulf War, one in the north to protect Kurds, another in the south to protect Shia populations, required continuous military enforcement. American and British aircraft patrolled Iraqi skies almost daily, frequently engaging Iraqi air defenses. This low-intensity conflict continued throughout the 1,990 seconds, occasionally escalating into significant strikes when Iraq challenged the zones. The enforcement operations kept American attention focused on Iraq and maintained a military posture oriented toward eventual confrontation. The rise of regime change as policy. By the late 1,990 seconds, influential voices in American foreign policy circles were arguing that containment of Iraq had failed and that only regime change could resolve the threat Saddam Hussein posed. In January 1998, the Project for the New American Century, a neoconservative think tank whose members included future administration officials Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, sent an open letter to President Bill Clinton advocating military action to remove Saddam from power. The letter argued that containment was eroding, that Iraq would eventually acquire weapons of mass destruction, and that American security demanded decisive action. The neoconservative foreign policy vision extended beyond Iraq. Its proponents believed that American military supremacy should be used actively to reshape the international order, spreading democracy and liberal values while eliminating threats before they materialized. They viewed the cautious realism of the elder Bush's administration, which had declined to pursue regime change in 1991, as a failure of nerve. A 1,992 defense planning guidance document, drafted by Paul Wolfowitz, had outlined a grand strategy of American primacy, preventing the emergence of any rival power and maintaining overwhelming military dominance. Though the document was leaked and officially repudiated, its ideas continued to circulate within conservative foreign policy circles. When George W. Bush campaigned for the presidency in 2000, he advocated what he called a humble foreign policy, criticizing the Clinton administration's nation-building efforts in the Balkans and elsewhere. Yet his foreign policy team included many of the same individuals who had been calling for regime change in Iraq. The tension between Bush's campaign rhetoric and the interventionist inclinations of his advisors would be resolved by the traumatic events of the 11th of September 2001. The transformative shock of September 11. The terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans transformed the strategic landscape in which decisions about Iraq would be made. Within hours of the attacks, senior officials in the Bush administration began discussing whether Iraq should be targeted alongside Afghanistan. Notes taken by a Pentagon official captured Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's thinking. Consideration was being given to whether intelligence was sufficient to strike both Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein simultaneously. President Bush articulated this new approach in his January 2002 State of the Union address, identifying Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as an axis of evil that threatened world peace. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. The speech signaled that Iraq had moved to the center of American strategic attention, even as military operations continued in Afghanistan against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The connection between September 11 and Iraq was always tenuous. Iraq had not been involved in the attacks. The perpetrators were members of al-Qaeda, an organization with which Saddam Hussein's secular Ba'athist regime had no meaningful relationship. The 19 hijackers were predominantly Saudi nationals, not Iraqis. Yet administration officials worked assiduously to create the impression of linkage in the public mind. Vice President Dick Cheney repeatedly suggested connections between Iraq and al-Qaeda that intelligence agencies could not confirm. The conflation of distinct threats, terrorism, and weapons proliferation provided the rhetorical foundation for military action against a country that had not attacked the United States. Colin Powell and the Case for War. On the 5th of February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell delivered a presentation to the United Nations Security Council that represented the administration's most comprehensive public case for war. Powell was chosen precisely because of his credibility. He was widely respected as a moderate voice within an administration dominated by hawks. If Powell believed the evidence justified war, the reasoning went, surely the case must be compelling. For more than an hour, Powell presented what he described as irrefutable proof of Iraqi weapons programs and deception. He displayed satellite photographs purporting to show weapons facilities and decontamination vehicles. He played audio recordings of intercepted communications between Iraqi military officers allegedly discussing the concealment of prohibited materials. Most memorably, he held up a small vial, explaining that it represented the quantity of anthrax that could prove devastating if deployed as a weapon. "Every statement I make today is backed up by sources," Powell declared. "These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence." He claimed that Iraq possessed mobile biological weapons laboratories, that it was reconstituting its nuclear program, and that it harbored terrorist operatives linked to al-Qaeda. The presentation would come to symbolize the intelligence failures and manipulations that characterized the march to war. Within months of the invasion, it became clear that Powell's assertions were largely unfounded. The mobile biological weapons laboratories did not exist. The aluminum tubes he cited as evidence of nuclear weapons development were intended for conventional rockets. The claims of Iraqi al-Qaeda connections were discredited. Powell himself would later call the presentation a blot on his record, acknowledging that much of what he said. The invasion. When diplomatic efforts failed to secure Security Council authorization, the United States proceeded with what it called a coalition of the willing. A group of countries led by the United States and Britain, with smaller contingents from Australia and Poland. The force was far smaller than the coalition assembled for the Gulf War. Approximately 170,000 troops, compared to nearly 1 million in 1991. Administration officials believed this would be sufficient to achieve a quick victory and expressed confidence that Iraqi resistance would collapse rapidly. On the 17th of March 2003, President Bush issued an ultimatum giving Saddam Hussein 48 hours to leave Iraq or face military action. 2 days later, on March 19, American forces launched the invasion with an airstrike targeting the Iraqi leadership, an attempt at decapitation that proved unsuccessful. The following day, coalition ground forces crossed from Kuwait into Iraq, while a massive aerial bombardment began what military planners called shock and awe. On el 9 de abril de 2003, American forces entered central Baghdad. In Firdos Square, Marines assisted a crowd of Iraqis in toppling a large statue of Saddam Hussein, an image broadcast worldwide as a symbol of regime collapse. The scene was heavily covered by media outlets, though later analysis revealed that the crowd was smaller than initial reports suggested, and that the event was partially staged for cameras. Regardless, the message was clear. Saddam's 30-year rule had ended. Within 3 weeks of the invasion's start, organized Iraqi military resistance had ceased. On May 1, President Bush landed on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and delivered a speech beneath a banner reading, "Mission accomplished." The words would haunt his administration for years as the conflict devolved into insurgency, sectarian civil war, and an occupation lasting nearly 9 years. The catastrophe of occupation, the rapidity of military victory, obscured the absence of planning for what would follow. The Bush administration had devoted extensive attention to war planning, but remarkably little to post-war reconstruction and governance. The Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, intended to manage the transition, was established only in January 2003, less than 3 months before the invasion. The assumption underlying this neglect was that victory would be self-sustaining. Liberated Iraqis would embrace their liberators, a new government would emerge organically, and American forces would withdraw within months. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. In the immediate aftermath of Baghdad's fall, widespread looting engulfed the capital. Government ministries were ransacked and burned. Hospitals, museums, and universities were stripped. The electrical grid, already degraded by years of sanctions, was further damaged. Water treatment facilities ceased functioning. American forces, insufficient in number and lacking clear guidance, watched the chaos unfold without intervening. Secretary Rumsfeld dismissed the disorder with the now infamous comment that stuff happens. On the 11th of May 2003, President Bush appointed L. Paul Bremer as the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, which would govern Iraq during the occupation. Bremer arrived in Baghdad with 2 draft orders that would shape the subsequent catastrophe. Coalition Provisional Authority Order Number 1, issued on May 16, mandated de-Baathification of Iraqi society. All senior members of the Ba'ath Party, the top 4 ranks, were banned from government employment. The intent was to remove the pillars of Saddam's regime and prevent their return to power, analogous to the denazification of Germany after World War II. In practice, the order removed from government not merely regime loyalists, but also the technocrats and professionals who kept ministries functioning. Many Iraqis had joined the Ba'ath Party not out of ideological commitment, but because membership was required for advancement in virtually any professional field. Teachers, engineers, doctors, and civil servants found themselves suddenly unemployed. Estimates of those affected ranged from 30,000 to 50,000 individuals. 1 week later, on May 23, Bremer issued Order Number 2, dissolving the Iraqi military, security services, and intelligence agencies. Approximately 400,000 soldiers and officers were summarily dismissed. Unlike de-Baathification, this order surprised even senior American officials. Secretary of State Powell later stated that he was not consulted. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice was not informed. CIA Director Tenet was stunned. The decision reversed previous planning that had assumed the Iraqi army would be essential for post-war security. The consequences were immediate and severe. Hundreds of thousands of armed men, many with military training and combat experience, found themselves unemployed, humiliated, and hostile to the American occupiers. They knew where weapons were stored. They possessed the organizational skills to coordinate resistance. Combined with de-Baathification, the dissolution of the army created a large pool of individuals with every reason to oppose the new order and the capabilities to do so effectively. By the autumn of 2003, an insurgency was underway. Former regime elements, dismissed soldiers, and foreign fighters drawn by the opportunity to confront American forces launched attacks on coalition troops, Iraqi security personnel, and civilian infrastructure. Improvised explosive devices became the signature weapon, roadside bombs that could destroy armored vehicles and kill or maim their occupants. Suicide bombings targeted police stations, government buildings, and civilian gatherings. The security situation deteriorated steadily. The absence of weapons of mass destruction fundamentally undermined the case for war. Administration officials who had spoken with such certainty were compelled to acknowledge that the primary justification had been wrong. President Bush himself, in his memoir, wrote that he was shocked and angry when the weapons were not found. Yet he continued to insist that removing Saddam Hussein had been the right decision, shifting emphasis to the humanitarian and democratization rationales. The decision to invade Iraq revealed the dangers of preventive war doctrine, the consequences of intelligence failure, and the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. The ease of military victory 3 weeks to topple a regime obscured the immense difficulty of what followed. Nation building, which the Bush administration had criticized during the 2000 campaign, proved unavoidable once regime change had been accomplished. Scholars and analysts continue to debate why the United States invaded Iraq. For some, the primary driver was genuine. If mistaken, belief in the threat posed by Iraqi weapons programs, a belief intensified by the trauma of September 11 and the fear of catastrophic terrorism. For others, weapons of mass destruction served as a convenient justification for objectives determined by ideology, geopolitics, or economic interest. The neoconservative vision of transforming the Middle East through American power played an undeniable role. So did the accumulated frustrations of a decade of containment that seemed increasingly unsustainable. What is certain is that the invasion represented one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions in American history. A decision made on the basis of flawed intelligence, inadequate planning, and assumptions about the post-war environment that proved spectacularly wrong. The costs, measured in lives lost, resources expended, and credibility squandered, continue to shape American foreign policy and the broader Middle East to the present day. The Iraq War demonstrated that military supremacy, however overwhelming, cannot substitute for political judgment. The United States possessed the power to destroy Saddam Hussein's regime in a matter of weeks. It did not possess the understanding, the patience, or the commitment to build a stable successor state from the wreckage. The lesson was one that earlier generations had learned and forgotten: that beginning a war is far easier than ending one, and that the consequences of military intervention extend far beyond the battlefield into realms that generals cannot control.